Hello everybody, welcome back to the studio. My name is Justin and I have something a little bit different this week. I want to show you what I think is probably the best project for new leather workers and the best product for the holiday craft markets. So you've probably seen this style wallet many times, especially here on YouTube. But the reason I think it's great for beginners is because it requires very little leather, very basic tool set, and it can be made extremely fast. For all those reasons, it's good for beginners. I think it's also really good for markets because if you're attending a holiday market, the craft market, where there's no entry fee for the customers, that means you're going to get a lot of people walking through that aren't necessarily looking to spend money. So you need to make sure you have products that are within that impulse purchase price range. And I think this wallet fits that bill perfectly. So if you haven't already, head over to my website, download the free plans, and let's get into this. So as I said, this is a very basic wallet pattern. It's one piece, less than a quarter square foot of leather, so you can use up small pieces, and the tooling required is extremely simple. So what have we got here? We've got a pair of dividers to set our stitch spacing. You don't technically need this. If you have a two-pronged iron, that can also work just fine. We have our stitching chisels. We have an awl for tracing the pattern. Regular knife. Edge beveler. This is a number 1 Odin. We've got a hole punch for the corners. Now, if you don't have a single hole punch, you probably have one of those rotary ones, which will work just as well. Some thread. I've got a mallet or a hammer here with a polished head for hammering down the stitching. 12-inch ruler, lighter, tokenol, canvas cloth, 3 grits of sandpaper, 180, 320, and 600, and then a mallet for hitting our chisels. That's a pretty basic set of tools. It's not going to cost you much to get started, and you'll be able to produce a pretty sweet product. Okay, so step 1 is getting our cardstock template cut out. So this is fairly basic. You want to keep that line intact. So you're cutting just to the outside of the black line in order to maintain the proper dimensions. One nice thing about this pattern, because it's so basic, if your dimensions are off slightly, it won't matter. So to cut out our corners here, you can actually use your punch to punch out the cardstock. Just line it up with the inside of the black lines. And this will give you a guide to then trace out your pattern onto the leather. Then it's just a matter of putting our ruler down and getting our straight lines. So you can see here that my corner punch didn't go actually right to the corner. So what I can do is just by hand cut out that corner. That can also work just as well if you don't want to use the punch to punch out your pattern. If you're not comfortable with your knife skills yet, I suggest using the punch and not worrying if it's slightly off, like mine was. Because again, this is a simple, fast pattern, so it doesn't need to be perfect. So a few things to consider when you're tracing out your pattern on your leather. One, is the surface of the leather nice and smooth? If it is, then it's going to mean your pattern's sliding all around. So you could tape the whole thing down and then cut through the tape into the leather. That's an option. You could flip it over and put the pattern on the back side. Then it's not going to move around. Or you could do what I prefer to do. So I'm just going to place my pattern and make a mark on the two sides at each corner. My hand isn't moving, it's holding the template down, so nothing's likely to shift on me. Then I remove that, and then those two marks, I just connect the dots. A nice light pass. If it takes multiple passes to go through, that's fine. So there's our width perfectly cut out. And we didn't have to worry about tracing, putting a line all the way down. We just connected the dots. Now to get the end, we just hold that in place. Trace that one side and then move the pattern. Then we just follow that pattern, that mark with our nice sharp blade. When you're going around a curve like this, think about turning from the elbow and not the wrist. If you do that, that'll actually make it really easy to follow a nice arc. If you do that, it makes following a curve like this really easy if you're thinking about pivoting from your elbow back here and not trying to turn with your wrist. So then we bring our pattern back up, line it up, and then make that second cut. Simple. That's all cut out. So now we can go ahead and trace out our thumb slot. This may seem like a bit of an obvious point, but whenever I'm using an awl, I'm always dragging it away or in the direction that I'm moving. So I'm not straight up and down, and I'm never trying to push it. Seems like an obvious point, but sometimes the obvious needs to be said. We can cut out the center. So I'll show you punching those two edges or those two corners with a hole punch, and then I'll do that freehand so you can see the difference. So I'm just lining it up right with those lines. And then hopefully I've lined it up properly. In this case I got lucky. That's great. Same thing there. That one slightly off, but it's good enough. So then we will cut out those little bits. Now to do the straight parts, line up with that line. Stop just before we get to the corner. Same thing on this side. And then our bottom, and now we'll do the corners without the punch. I prefer to do the corners without the punch. Just find it gets me a cleaner result. So with my straight line there, I'm just going to come around, follow that all mark, and match it up with the other straight line. So that's why I do the straight lines first. It gives me a connecting point for that curve. Almost gives me something to aim towards. And that's that. So then this curve up here, I'm going to do the same thing and just clean it up from that punch. There we go. So a little bit of 180. Get into that corner, into the transition. Once that's all cleaned up and it looks good, we can sand down this top edge. This shouldn't need much because we use a nice sharp blade to make that cut. All we're going to do is just slightly smooth out that surface just in case there's any imperfection in the cut. Quick sand will clean that up. So I use 2 grits, got on 180. Move over to my 220. Always working in one direction at this point. And then inside, if you need to roll up the sandpaper to get into there, that works really well. You can spend as much time on this as you want. If you want to make these a super affordable purchase option for the craft market, I would say don't spend as much time sanding. Maybe just do a 220. Just start with this grit, 220, smooth it out. Take our edge beveler, clean this up. and then go straight to Tokonol. Most people are not going to notice the difference if this is super polished and perfect, especially at a certain price point. They just won't be expecting it. It's an important thing to remember. So what is the customer expecting based on the market itself or the style of product that you normally make? The stuff I tend to gear towards is going to be a little bit more refined. I don't usually use my Japanese style irons, but there's a huge variety of styles that you can go with, and some lend themselves better to certain types of markets. Or if you're not selling at markets and you're just making these for fun, whatever your preferred style is. So take this edge beveling, all this stuff, and adjust it to your style so it works for you. So after that is done, I'm going to come in with 600. Further smooth that edge out before I apply Tokonol. This will also go faster if you have a Dremel. I'm intentionally not using it, even though I have one, just to show you how easy it is to do without it. But I'll tell you, that Dremel makes quick work of an edge. So if there's something you want to purchase to be a little bit more efficient, I would say a Dremel may be the best option. Okay, so that's nice and smooth. Just get a bit of Tokonol. Perfect. Now, this part can be a little bit awkward to get in here and keep it nice and clean. In other words, not getting Tokonol all over the place. That's why I just use a little bit, spread it around. If you think you need more Tokonol, add a little bit more after. This is especially something to consider if the leather you're using is going to stain if you get Tokonol on the surface. Be very diligent about applying it cleanly in here, because the last thing you want to do is stain the exterior. Okay, so those edges are all polished. Now we're going to go over and punch our stitch line. I'm just going to go over to this bench, which is a little more solid for punch in. The pattern has center marks, so use that as a guide for how far to punch down, because you want to punch down the same amount on both sides and obviously all four corners. So we'll give ourselves a mark to just above the center, because we have to consider that this will be folded, so we don't want to go all the way. So to do the first one, I'm going to hang the tooth off and get my mallet. Hang the tooth off the top, down, and then punch through. You can see how much I go through. It's not all the way, just enough. I always overlap by 2 teeth in order for my iron to stay nice and straight. Adjust this up a little bit. Okay, so that was 1 punch with the tooth hanging over the top. I overlapped by 2. So if we fold this over, I think we'll go for 2 more. So punch 1, overlap by 2, and then I'll punch 2 extra holes. So I'll do that on this side. Overlap. 2. And 2. Same thing on this side. You'll note that I'm punching all sides first because I'm not going to be gluing this together. Again, in an effort to save a bit of time, we're not going to glue it, and we will just fold it and then stitch it, which is perfectly fine. If you want to go ahead and glue this first and then punch right through, perfectly fine. Just know that you want to make sure your iron stays nice and straight when punching through 2 layers of leather. Now we can stitch. So I'm using these ones. So these irons are a 5mm stitch spacing. You can use a 0.6mm Ritza Tiger thread. It's a good combination. And then the length, I'm going to do, I think I'll do 5 to, yeah. Normally I do 5 times my length. That's usually enough. So I'll just say 4 inches to 4, 5. I need my snips. Usually I pierce the thread twice. I've never had an issue with it coming apart when I do that. But on occasion, when I pierce it once, it has come undone on me, and that's pretty frustrating. So, always pierce it twice. Your results may vary. And then for the first time, I'm going to show you how I would stitch this without using a pony, or without using a clamp, whatever you call it. Now, I will say that this is not my preferred method of stitching. I don't do it a whole lot. So there could be some techniques to use that would be maybe more efficient, but this one seems to work pretty well for me. So, going to start on this end, finish at the top, and then back stitch twice. Then when I do the other side, I'll start here and do the same thing over. So I'll show you how to stitch from right to left and then left to right. So start in the last hole, put your needles through, and then make sure they're even, and then pull through and tighten up right on the end. always take the needle that's on the side of the direction you're stitching. So I'm stitching to the right, so my right needle drops. Pick up my left needle, and then pulling my thread back, I'm going to put that needle through. Make sure I tension down properly. Once this first stitch gets locked in, it's going to be a lot easier to hold this because it'll hold these two in place. So, repeat again. Needle through. I'm going to drop it, grab it with my fingers, holding it back, and then this needle goes in the front of that next hole. So it's your needle, the thread that you're holding, and then the tail. Come through, make sure it's tensioned properly. And we do it again. So needle goes through, drop it, grab the needle in the back, and then pull that front thread tight, making sure that this needle is in the front of the hole. So the only thing you want to be paying attention to here is that your tension on the back is even. You want to make sure that you're always pulling this with your fingers here, making sure you're pulling that nice and tight, and putting the needle into the front of that next hole. So it gets pretty fluid once you remember all the steps. And this method is pretty nice because you don't need a fancy stitching pony or anything like that. You can stitch this anywhere, so you can sit on the couch, watch a movie. Then when you get to the end, I want to wrap this one around. Back into that first hole. Try not to pierce your thread when you come through. Tighten that down. Now take the back one, wrap it around. That's looping over the top. Make sure this thread sits side by side. You don't want those two to cross over. And then back stitch once or twice, whatever is your preference. I'll usually do 2 times, but then only come through so that the front part of the wallet is clean. The back part, will have the back part will have the 2 ends that I've clipped. And we just take the lighter, melt those ends. There we go. So that's pretty even on the front and the back. Now, like I said, there's many methods to stitching without a pony. This is the one that seems to work for me. This is the one I teach all of my students when I'm teaching in person. And it seems to be the method that's picked up the quickest with most students. So it's a good one to start with if you're just starting out. Learn this one and then kind of graduate up to the slightly more technical methods of a saddle stitch with the pony, with the French irons. It's all more or less the same techniques and achieve about the same results with a nice slant on both sides. Now that slant is because the irons that I'm using are Japanese style irons, which are kind of like a combination of a French iron and a diamond pricking iron. So if you just use a diamond pricking iron, you may not get this nice slant, or if you use the round dent irons, you probably won't be getting the same slant that I get right here. But by the way, the technique will be the same. So starting in our second last hole, again, always starting on the front side of the wallet. Pull those through. Make sure if you're using the tiger thread that's flat, try to keep it untwisted, so that when you pull it through, that thread lays flat. If you get a twist in it, you can sometimes see it. Usually if you hammer it out, you won't see the twist, but just make an effort to make sure the thread is fairly flat. It'll just result in a nicer, clean stitch. Okay, so I'm going to even these up again. I'm faffing around here. And then we can stitch like normal. So this time working right to left, it's a little bit more finicky with how you hold this thread. Because you want your front thread to be held back, we already have our right hand occupied by stitching. So it's a little less convenient to stitch this way, but once you understand that you just want to make sure your needle is in front, it's not that big a deal. So sometimes that can happen. You drop your thread and then it winds around the other one. Just make sure they're always separated so you don't get all twisted. So the other nice thing about this style of stitching is that it kind of lends itself well to, well, for lack of a better word, a more rustic style of wallet. So if you have pieces of leather that maybe have some blemishes, maybe have some marks that are still structurally sound, they're not weak, but maybe they're not perfect, I think this style of stitching lends itself really well to that. Kind of a wall that you take on a job site. You're not worried about getting beat up, but it's still going to be able to take some wear. This style works really well for that. Okay, so now loop around the top. Loop around the top. Make sure you don't pierce your thread when you're coming through on the back side. Tighten that down. Same thing when you're coming through on these ones. Try to not pierce the thread because you can actually push it out and then loosen off that knot. Nice and tight, and then we did 3 on this side, so we'll do 1 more through there, and there we go. Lighter. There we go, and then we can come over. This is where I like the polished hammerhead for hammering down the thread. I'll give you a close-up shot of the thread here. That's looking pretty good. Nice and even on the front. Nice and even on the back. So now we just want to clean up our edges. Now another thing with not gluing this is that you technically could finish these edges first. The reason I didn't is because if your cutting isn't perfectly, if you haven't cut the edges perfectly straight, you haven't lined up or punched your holes perfect, then once all of this gets tightened down, this edge can be uneven. Now in this case, it's like perfectly flat, so I'm just have this gap here, but if your edge comes out and it's slightly uneven on either side, this is when you can just take your sandpaper and even everything out. But if we've all done everything right, it shouldn't come out too uneven. That's all that took. So I just get my edge beveler out, knock off that lip. Before we stitch this, you could have also thrown your logo on the front or on the back, wherever you'd like to place it. We take our next grit, smooth that out. Again, working in one direction. So one reason you may want to glue your edge is because you can see the gap in there. Right, obviously it's not glued, so you're going to be able to see that. So if you want that nice and smooth, a nice clean tight edge, that would be a reason to glue it. But if you watch my last video, I pointed out where you need to be careful with gluing, with where you add the glue. If you've punched from both sides, you only want glue from your punch hole to the edge. Make sure you don't get any glue in along the actual stitch line, or else it'll gum everything up and make it a little more difficult to stitch. There we go. There is your basic card holder wallet. Great first project if you've never done leather work before. Super easy and only requires a minimal amount of tools. Hey everybody, hope you've enjoyed that one. If you have any questions or comments, as usual, leave them in the comment section below. And hopefully this wallet, this simple design, gives you some ideas for maybe some markets you're going to have coming up in the holiday season, or some products you want to start selling to friends and family and all that kind of thing. Leathercraft is a really fun hobby. It is pretty accessible if you use the right tools and the right methods. It does not have to be that expensive. You can find super affordable leathers. There's so many suppliers out there selling really nice leather for a really good price. And stuff like this is really good for those smaller pieces because you don't have to buy whole sets of leather. You don't have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on leather. You can buy almost scrap stuff or belly cuts, which are way cheaper. Really accessible options to get into this craft. If you have any questions regarding that, maybe more in-depth questions, head to my website, send me an email. I'm always happy to help. And if you haven't already, head over to my website, norfolkhandmade.com. You can download the plans for this. If you're wondering what type of tools I use in my shop, if you go to my website under the resources section, you're going to see a full list of all the tools and materials that I use in my studio. A bunch of those links are affiliate links. So if you click on them and you end up making a purchase, then I get a small commission. That includes all of my xTOOL links for the laser and all of that fun stuff as well. So again, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it. We will see you in the next one.